For a long time, the story of the Celts slept beneath the soil of Europe, not in a gentle, peaceful sleep, but in a sleep so deep that entire civilizations built themselves on top of its quiet body, without ever knowing what lay beneath their feet. And yet, if you walk across certain valleys in Austria, if you pause at the edge of certain hills in southern Germany, if you run your hand across certain fields in France, where the wind moves like a whisper across the grass, you might feel it. Not a sound, not a sight, but a presence. Something old, something waiting, something almost awake. It is a strange thing, how a civilization can die and live at the same time. How thousands of years can pass over a people until they vanish from memory, yet their spirit still lingers, like smoke trapped inside the stones. And perhaps the strangest truth of all is this: the Celts were never meant to disappear. Their beginning was too fierce, too bright, too impossible, to ever fade completely. But before the spirals of Latin, before the warriors painted in blue, before the druids whispered beneath sacred groves, before Rome feared them, before Britain rose and fell beneath them, there were only shadows, the earliest stirrings of a culture that would one day reshape half a continent. And that is where this story truly begins, in the quiet, in the soil, long before anyone alive today ever learned the word Celtic, long before the myths, before the music, before the stories of magic and iron and oak, long before the names that echo across Europe now, like fading thunder. It begins in the Bronze Age, with a people who cremated their dead and gathered the ashes in thousands of urns, laid carefully in great fields, so vast and so uniform that scholars today still stare in disbelief at the precision of a society that should have been too primitive to care so much about order. But they did care. They cared enough to craft pottery that matched across hundreds of miles. They cared enough to melt bronze so expertly that the shapes of their tools were nearly identical from the Danube to the Rhine. They cared enough to build entire cemeteries for a future that would forget their names. This was the Urnfield culture, a world rising quietly in the centre of Europe, a world in transition, a world that carried the first heartbeat of what we would one day call the Celts. It is tempting, now, to look back and imagine them as simple, wandering tribes moving through the forests without purpose or memory. But that is not what the earth reveals. The earth tells us something different, something deeper, something almost unsettling, because the people of the Urnfields were organized, disciplined, connected in ways that prehistoric societies were not meant to be. They traded metal across rivers that stretched longer than entire kingdoms. They developed burial customs that spread like a single breath across the spine of Europe. And when the time came, they stepped quietly, but firmly, into a world of iron. Iron, the metal that changes everything. Iron does not bend the way bronze does. Iron is harder, darker, is hungrier. It leaves sharper edges, cuts deeper wounds, demands hotter fires, and more determined hands. And from the moment these early Europeans learned to work it, the continent began to change. In the mountains of Austria, in a place we now call Hallstatt, miners carved deep into the earth to extract salt, white gold, the ancient world's lifeblood. Salt preserved food. Salt preserved life. Salt created wealth, and wealth created power. Inside the mines, the air was cold and strangely still. Wooden supports, preserved for thousands of years by the salt's dry embrace, stand today like frozen memories. And among them, tools appear, iron picks, bronze fittings, objects meant not for ceremony, but for work. Hard work, deep work, the kind of work that shapes civilizations without ever intending to. Hallstatt became more than a mine. It became a world, unto itself, a network of trade, of metal, of knowledge, of ideas moving like currents. Across Europe and around it, something was forming, a new kind of society filled with new symbols, new technologies, new ambitions. At first, no one knew what this new identity was. Not the miners, not the smiths, not the traders crossing mountain passes with wagons full of iron weapons and salt-bright crystals. But the land knew, the river valleys knew, and time knew. Time always knows. Before we do, iron spread, wealth expanded, social hierarchies appeared, small at first, then towering. Burials grew larger, more elaborate, filled with gold, with chariots, with feasts meant for the dead, but built for the living. And somewhere between the fires of the forges and the silence of the mines, between the urnfields of the past and the rising mounds of new elites, a culture crystallized. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, inevitably, as if Europe itself had been waiting. For this moment, these were the proto-Celts. Not yet the warriors of legend, not yet the lords of the Western world, not yet the people who would terrify Rome, but the builders of foundations, upon which all of it would one day stand. Their pottery carried geometric patterns that travelled farther than the people who made them. Their iron blades held signatures of carbon content that modern metallurgists still struggle to replicate. Their settlements became organised, fortified, protected not just by walls, but by ideas, ideas of community, of hierarchy, of memory. No one alive then could have known what they had started. But looking back now, with the advantage of centuries, we can see it clearly. The Celts were coming, and Europe was beginning to reshape itself so they could rise. But the most haunting truth is this: their story did not begin with warriors, or druids, or chariots, or spirals, or the clash of swords. It began with silence, with ashes in urns, with miners scraping salt from ancient stone, with a quiet transition from bronze to iron, with interconnected communities that did not yet know. They were building a civilization that would one day span from Ireland to Anatolia. It began in the dark, in caves, in mines, in the unlit corners of prehistory. And tonight, as you listen, we return to that darkness together, not to be afraid of it, but to follow the faint spark glowing at its centre, the spark that would one day ignite the Celtic world. If you wish to continue this journey through ancient memory, through forgotten landscapes, through the rise of a people who shaped the soul of Europe, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives life to the stories that time has buried and allows me to bring back worlds that have been silent for far too long. And before you move on, before you let the night pull you further into the forgotten corridors of time, there is something else you should know. Civilizations do not appear out of nowhere. They gather themselves piece by piece, layer by layer, like sediment forming across a riverbed over thousands of years. If you kneel in an Austrian valley and scoop a handful of soil, you are not just touching dirt, you are touching stories compressed under centuries of wind and winter. You are touching echoes of footfalls that no longer belong to any living person. You are touching the residue of fires long extinguished, the minerals of forgotten tools, the dust of broken pottery that once carried grain from hand to hand. This is the paradox of the Celtic beginning, a world rising quietly beneath another world that rose just as quietly on top of it. And if you listen closely, you might notice something else. These early Celts did not just build settlements. They built patterns, not just houses, but habits, not just tools, but technologies of memory. And in these patterns, you can sense a kind of determination that does not usually belong to prehistoric societies. A determination to understand the land, to master metal, to organize life in ways that made sense. not just for one generation, but for many. There are moments when history feels like a river that knows exactly where it is going long before it arrives. The rise of the Celts was one of those moments. Iron spread from tribe to tribe, like a secret being passed, from one whispered conversation to the next. Salt flowed through the mountains, in wagons heavy enough to carve their own paths into the stone, and in every direction, north, south, east, west. The quiet intensity of this rising culture began to pull the continent into its orbit. Archaeologists speak of this time as if it were a puzzle they are still trying to solve. Shards of pottery here, fragments of spearheads there, burial mounds that look similar even when separated by entire countries. A strange unity for a people who never built an empire, never crowned a single king, over all their territories, never erected a palace whose walls shouted their power to the sky. And yet, in their own mysterious way, they were everywhere, from the Danube to the Rhine, from the Alps to the rolling plains of future Gaul, from the Black Forest to the foothills of Bohemia. Their presence spread like a breath, exhaled across the continent, not with armies, not with proclamations, but with an idea, the idea that life could be shaped with metal and meaning. That craft was a form of identity. That community was a form of strength. That memory was a form of immortality. And as you picture them now, these proto-Celtic hands shaping bronze, carrying salt, burying urns, you may feel a small pull inside you, a recognition, a flicker of something almost familiar. Because in many ways, they were not just ancestors of the Celtic world, they were ancestors of the modern mind. When they standardized pottery, they taught the world the value of uniformity. When they mapped trade routes, they taught the world that distance was an obstacle meant to be solved. When they crafted iron tools with mathematical precision, they taught the world that excellence could be engineered. Even before writing, they were already thinking in systems. And then came the turning point that scholars still debate, a shift so subtle that no one living at the time could have recognized it. The old world began to fall away. The Bronze Age folded itself back into the earth, and the Iron Age stepped forward like a figure emerging from a doorway of fire. This was not just a change in material, it was a change in possibility. Iron allowed for deeper ploughs, for stronger fences, for sharper blades. It allowed for better tools, better weapons, better means of shaping forests into fields and communities into something more enduring than wandering villages. It allowed for hierarchy, for leadership, for warriors who carried blades long enough to inspire both pride and fear. And in this new world, the Celts began to awaken. You might imagine a single moment, a spark in the dark, when everything shifted, and suddenly the Celtic world stood shining in its full identity. But the truth is softer, slower, more human. Their identity was not declared. It was grown. It grew in the hands of a miner lifting a block of salt from the earth. It grew in the design of a potter pressing geometric lines into wet clay. It grew in the arms of a warrior burying a father beneath a mound, large enough to outlast winter and memory alike. It grew because they lived, because they worked, because they believed that what they built should last. And though they did not know it, the world was already listening. The rivers carried their goods, their customs, their silent philosophies to lands far beyond their imagination. And soon, tribes who had never met began to share the same shapes, the same tools, the same rituals, the same vision. This was not coincidence. It was connection, a quiet web, stretching across Europe, long before the word Europe had any meaning. And tonight, as you rest here, listening in the dark, you are standing at the very beginning of that web. You are at the threshold of a civilization just starting to understand its own power, and you can feel it. The stir, the shift, the first vibration of a culture that would one day sing through metal, through stone, through memory, through time. The Celts were coming, not with a roar, not with an explosion, not with a single dramatic birth, but with a slow, unstoppable rising from the heart of Europe itself. And as we step forward into their world, one breath at a time, let yourself remember, every civilization begins with a whisper. Thank you for staying with me in this opening chapter. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. It helps these ancient stories continue their long journey into the modern world, and it gives me the strength to create the next parts for you, softly, patiently, and with all the care these forgotten civilizations deserve. Are you ready to follow the Celts to the next threshold? For a long time, before anyone ever traced the spirals of Latin, before the word Celtic meant anything at all, there was a mountain in the heart of Europe that hummed quietly beneath thousands of feet of stone, not loud, not fierce, just a low, patient hum, the kind that old places make when they are holding secrets they know the world is not yet ready to hear. If you stand there now, in the thin morning air of Hallstatt, you might feel it rising through the soles of your shoes. A Fangpuls, a memory that does not belong to you, a whisper that has waited far longer than any human lifetime, because this was where the Celtic world truly began to gather its brightness, not in a battlefield, not in a ritual grove, not in a king's hall, but in the dark, deep underground, where salt sleeps like ancient snow, and time folds itself into glittering walls that do not melt. Salt, the quiet, pale treasure of the ancient world. Salt that preserved meat, preserved trade, preserved life. Salt that turned mountains into vaults of wealth. And in Hallstatt, men carved into the mountainside with tools that now feel almost too simple to have opened a world. Wooden beams still stand in those tunnels, hardened by centuries of salt's dry embrace, as if the mountain itself decided to keep them, the way a museum keeps relics from a vanished age. The miners worked, in darkness lit only by flame, picking salt from the earth, grain by grain, hour by hour, their footprints sinking into the cold silence of a world that had not yet learned the word civilization, but something was forming, something slow, steady, relentless, because salt does not travel alone. Salt brings people, salt brings trade, salt brings power, and with power comes change. In the valleys below, iron flickered into being, still uncertain, still difficult to tame, but powerful enough to shift the direction of entire cultures. Iron, the metal that does not yield, does not soften, does not forgive. Iron gave sharper blades, firmer ploughs, stronger hands to those who learned to command its fire. And the people around Hallstatt did learn, slowly at first, then all at once, as if the mountain had breathed its hidden knowledge into the minds of the smiths. The smell of the forges mixed with the scent of pine, the ringing of metal carried across the water, the glow of fire painted the faces of men who understood that they were holding something the world would not soon forget. Their work did not stay in the valleys. Iron blades travelled along rivers that curled through forests like silver snakes. Salt bricks moved over mountain passes, their weight heavy enough to carve new paths into the stone. And everywhere the trade went, ideas followed, shapes, symbols, techniques, New ways of burying the dead, new ways of showing status, new ways of understanding what a community could be. Hallstatt was no longer just a mine. It had become a pulse point, the beating heart of a rising culture. Archaeologists today dig through graves, as large as houses, mounds that seem to swell with memory, with pride, with the quiet confidence of a society that had discovered its own potential. Chariots buried beside warriors, gold ornaments laid over the dead, like captured sunlight, weapons forged with such skill that even modern metallurgists stop to marvel at their precision. These mounds were not made in haste. They were made with intention, with reverence, with a sense of hierarchy that was new to this world. Because Hallstatt did something remarkable. It created elites, not kings in the way. Empires would later crown them, but leaders whose graves told stories of trade networks, craftmasters, and a social order beginning to rise from the mists of prehistory. A chieftain was no longer just the strongest warrior. He was a man whose influence stretched across valleys, whose goods came from lands his feet never touched, whose burial required entire communities to gather and remember. And beneath those leaders, something just as important was growing. Craft specialization, smiths whose hands could judge the heat of iron by the colour of the flame, artisans who carved patterns into antler and bone as though they were writing messages to the future, potters who shaped vessels geometrically perfect across regions so distant that no one can explain how they communicated. This consistency, this precision, this unity of style, it was not accident. It was identity, the Hallstatt identity, a quiet identity born not from conquest, but from craft, not from empire, but from exchange, not from grand cities, but from the way metal, salt, and earth began speaking the same language. And if you imagine these people now, the miners in dim tunnels, the smiths in glowing forges, the traders crossing mountain passes in the cold dawn, you may feel a strange closeness, because they were not yet Celts, not fully, not in the way history books use the word, but they were becoming, day by day, trade by trade, burial by burial. They were weaving themselves into something larger than any one valley, larger even than any single tribe. Hallstatt was the first spark of a cultural fire that would later roar across half a continent. The early Celts were gathering themselves, not suddenly, not loudly, but patiently, quietly, with a determination that feels almost peaceful when viewed from here, from the comfort of a present that has forgotten how difficult beginnings can be. There is something beautiful in that kind of quiet rise, something soothing, something almost tender, a civilization learning to stand, not through war, but through work, not through domination, but through mastery, not through shouting, but through the silent precision of hands shaping metal and memory. At the same time, you might picture them settling into evening, the glow of a forge fading, the mountain breathing cold air, down into the valley, the night settling softly over the rooftops. And in that moment, that small, ancient moment, you can almost hear the sound of a future gathering, a future preparing itself to rise. Because the Celts did not begin with a roar. They began with a hum in the mines, a hum in the forges, a hum in the trade routes that stretched farther than anyone realized. A hum that would one day become a voice that would one day shake empires. But here, in this early chapter, the world is still quiet. The mountains are still calm. The fires are still small. And Hallstatt glows softly, the gentle, steady glow of a culture, awakening, if you are ready to follow that glow. Into the next chapter, Then breathe, rest your thoughts, and let the night carry you forward. And if you listen just a little longer, you may notice that the quiet glow of Hallstatt was not only the glow of fire and salt and metal, but the glow of something deeper, a shift in the human mind, so subtle and yet so powerful, that even now, thousands of years later, we can still feel its warmth, because in Hallstatt, people began to imagine their world differently. They began to see the mountain not just as stone or obstacle or shelter, but as a partner, a vast, patient being that offered salt and iron and space to carve new futures. They began to see the land not only as the place they walked across, but the place they belonged to, the place they inherited and shaped and passed down, like a quiet promise. And in return, the land shaped them. The sharp ridges gave them caution. The deep forests gave them endurance. The ice-fed lakes gave them memory. Cold, clear, and impossibly old, Hallstatt was not a kingdom. It was a conversation between people and mountains, between metal and mind, between memory and the slow unfolding of identity. And if you follow this conversation into the deeper layers of the archaeological record, you find more than graves and chariots and ornaments. You find footprints, real footprints, pressed into salt and preserved, as if time itself decided to hold its breath. The prints of children playing in the tunnels, the prints of miners dragging heavy sleds, the prints of animals brought down to pull loads through the silence. Every footprint, a moment, every moment, a life, every life, a thread in the long weave of Celtic becoming. And above ground, on the ridges, overlooking the water, villages grew, timber walls, woven fences, houses set close, for warmth, against winter winds. Inside those houses, life was not grand. It was simple, quiet, steady, the weaving of cloth, the shaping of pots, the grinding of grain, the soft murmur of stories told in the blue smoke of evening hearths. But simplicity does not mean weakness. From these small homes came the craftspeople, whose work travelled farther than their feet. Bronze brochures with curling ends, like frozen waves, iron knives with edges so clean they split bone without shattering it, amber beads carved from resin, carried across the sea from lands they would never see. This circulation of objects was not merely trade, it was communication, a language of craft that crossed mountains and rivers and entire regions. A pot in Hungary had the same pattern as a pot in Bavaria. A sword in Bohemia held the same curve as a sword in Switzerland. A brooch found in France matched one buried deep in an Austrian grave. It is as though the entire region began to share one heartbeat, not under one ruler, not under one temple, but under one quiet understanding. That beauty and skill and craft were forms of power, the kind of power that does not conquer, it convinces, the kind that does not roar, it resonates, the kind that does not dominate, it spreads. By being worth imitating, this was the Hallstatt secret, the gentle power of excellence. And slowly, as the centuries turned, that excellence hardened into structure. Families of artisans passed down skills that outsiders struggled to learn. Warriors formed bands, trained with iron weapons, balanced so perfectly they sliced air like birds' wings. Chieftains gathered wealth not through taxes, but through networks of loyalty and exchange. Society was no longer flat. It had shape, it had layers, it had direction, not rigid, not oppressive, but unmistakably present, a rising sense that some people held more responsibility, more influence, more memory, and so the great mounds grew larger. More goods were placed with the dead, more care was taken with the rituals that marked a life's passing, not because wealth was being flaunted, but because memory was being preserved. To bury a chieftain with a chariot was not to show power, it was to show continuity, the belief that the world deserved to remember those who shaped it. To place gold upon the chest of the dead was not vanity, it was gratitude, a way of saying that a life lived well could shine, even after breath had gone, and somewhere between those shimmering graves, and the quiet homes between the forges, and the mines between the mountain winds, and the soft glow of twilight fires, the Celtic identity crossed a threshold, still early, still forming, still humble, but no longer a whisper, no longer a flicker. Now it was a steady flame, the kind that does not burst upward, but expands slowly, reliably, the way dawn expands across a valley. This was the beginning of a people who would one day challenge empires, shape mythologies, carry stories through forests and fields, and carve their symbols into the very imagination of Europe. And yet, in this moment, in the Hallstatt dawn, they were still quiet, still small, still learning the weight and wonder of who they were becoming. But if you listen closely, you can hear it. The gathering of footsteps, the tightening of bonds, the growing certainty that the world was preparing itself for something extraordinary. Because every civilization has a season when it lifts its head toward the future and realizes that it is awake. And in Hallstatt, in the hush of mountain mornings and the glow of underground fire, the Celts opened their eyes, and the world would never be the same. For a long time after the glow of Hallstatt began to spread, across the valleys and rivers of Central Europe, another light, stranger, sharper, more fluid, more daring, began to rise at the continent's edge, not suddenly, not like a torch lifted high in the dark, but slowly, softly, like a shape forming beneath water, like a thought taking form in the quiet space between breaths. This new light did not come from mines, or from salt, or from the steady hum of iron being born. It came from imagination, from the moment a people looked at metal, not only as a tool, or a weapon, or a sign of power, but as something capable of carrying meaning, the way a river carries sky. This was Laten, a lakeside place, in what is now Switzerland, where ripples touch the bones of ancient piers and sunlight moves across the water as softly as memory. It was here that Celtic art began to dream, not in straight lines, not in rigid symbols, not in the angular certainty of earlier worlds, but in curves, curves that turned into spirals, spirals that bent into leaves, leaves that unfurled, into creatures half real, half imagined. The art of Laten was not simply created, it flowed across bronze, across iron, across gold so thin it shimmered like breath on the surface of cold air, across scabbards that curled like vines, across shields where animals leapt between real and unreal, across talks, those rings of power that sat upon the necks of warriors and nobles, each one shaped as if it had grown rather than been forged. The Celts had begun to see the world, not as a place to conquer, but as a place to express, and in that expression lay an identity so deep and so fluid that even now, thousands of years later, its beauty feels almost alive. Archaeologists lift Laten artifacts from riverbeds and graves and say that the metal seems to move even when it is still. Lines, coil, Twist, tighten, release, as if the metal remembers, the hands that shaped it, the breath that warmed it, the songs that must have risen from the fires where it was born. This was not simply decoration, it was worldview. In Latin, the Celts embraced fluidity, the sense that life bends, changes, shifts, that nothing stays perfectly still, yet everything remains connected. A spiral was not a symbol, it was a philosophy, a reminder that all things move outward and inward in the same breath. And as this new style spread outward from the lakes, the Celtic world began to change. Weapons became statements, shields became stories, jewelry became identity. A warrior walked into battle not only armed, but adorned, carrying the myth and meaning of his people on every surface of his gear. Even the simplest dagger sometimes carried designs so delicate that its maker must have worked by firelight with a patience only love or devotion could explain. But Latin was more than art. It was movement. The Celts were no longer centred only in the valleys of Austria or the ridges of Bavaria. Their world expanded like light, spilling outward in every direction, north, into the forests of what would one day be Germany, west, into the riverlands of future France, across the Channel, into Britain, where the wind carried their symbols, across chalk cliffs and rolling hills, south, into northern Italy, where Celts built settlements so vibrant that Roman writers described them with a mix of admiration and fear, and farther still, to the edges of Spain, to the plains of Hungary, to the hills of Bohemia, and even beyond, into Anatolia, where Celtic warriors founded the kingdom of Galatia. Everywhere they went, Latin followed, on sword hilts, on cauldrons, on chariot fittings, on mirrors that turned reflections into quiet prayers. A single style, a single flow, united a people, spread across nearly half a continent. No empire did this. No king ordered it. No authority enforced it. It spread because it resonated. It spread because it felt like truth. And behind this artistic wave was something deeper still, a shift in the Celtic mind. The early Celts of Hallstatt built power from salt, from metal, from trade, but the Celts of Latin built power from identity, from expression, from a sense that life itself was worthy of beauty. Beauty not as decoration, but as declaration, a way of saying, we are here, we shape the world, with our hands, with our stories, with our symbols, that move, the way rivers move. And beneath this beauty, a subtler transformation was taking place. Warriors became more than fighters. They became figures of status, symbols of power, adorned in metal, that whispered their lineage and their legend. Craftsmen rose in importance, valued not merely for what they made, but for the meaning they could coax from the raw bones of the earth. Communities grew more complex, networks stronger, trade routes wider. Culture became a force, a quiet force, a fluid force, but a force nonetheless. And somewhere between the spirals carved into sword scabbards and the curling motifs etched into golden talks, the Celts crossed another invisible threshold. They were no longer a rising people. They were a shaping people, a people whose identity was no longer forming, but flowering. Latin was their bloom, a bloom of metal, of motion, of meaning, of lines that danced, like wind over water, of symbols that seemed to breathe. And tonight, as you rest in the quiet, listening to this story, as though it were a river moving gently. Through the dark, you can almost feel the moment when the Celtic world opened like a flower. Beneath the sun, a soft unfolding, a widening, a reaching, a revelation in iron and gold. The Celts were no longer becoming. They had arrived. And in the next chapter, their world would rise higher still, toward kings, toward druids, toward stories that echo even now through forests and coastlines and the quiet corners of memory. When you are ready, we will step into that world together. And yet, even as the art of Latin shimmered across the surface of swords and shields and ornaments, worn close to the skin, something deeper was beginning to stir beneath the beauty, because the Celts of this age did not create only for the eye. They created for the spirit. They shaped metal the way others shaped myths. They carved lines into bronze the way poets carve meaning into silence. And through that shaping, something unseen began to form, a worldview woven from motion and memory, from the quiet belief that beauty itself was a kind of truth. If you walk through the museums where Latin artifacts now sleep behind glass, their shine dimmed only by distance, you might notice a strange feeling settling over you, a sense that these objects were never meant to be still, a sense that even in silence they remember the hands that held them. You might look at the sinuous lines on a scabbard, lines that coil like vines in wind, and feel that the artist was not merely decorating, but listening to the shape already inside the metal, waiting to be revealed, listening to the world breathing around him, listening to something ancient and soft and powerful that lived, not in temples or scriptures, but in the land itself, because the Celts did not pray to distant heavens. They prayed to rivers, to trees, to hills that rolled like sleeping beasts, to stones that stood in circles, older than memory, and the flowing lines of Latin were reflections of that world. The curve of a river bend, the swirl of a fern, the sweep of a bird's wing, cutting across morning light. The Celts made nature visible in metal, and metal in turn made their spirit visible. But beneath this artistry, their society was shifting. The warrior aristocracy grew more defined, their status marked, not just by arms, but by ornaments that shone like captured thunder. A torque was not simply jewelry, it was a vow, a circle that bound a warrior to his people, his lineage, his gods, a promise to carry strength with grace, to wield power with purpose, to walk into danger with the calm of someone who understands that bravery is not noise, it is steady breath in the face of uncertainty. And the druids, those keepers of memory and mystery, rose alongside them, their wisdom shaping the spiritual backbone of Celtic life. They were the ones who knew the old stories, the ones who read the forest as if it were a manuscript, written in leaves and wind. They carried no swords, yet kings. Listen to them. They built no temples, yet the people trusted them. Their power did not come from force, but from insight, a kind of quiet certainty that the world was woven together by laws older than any human tribe. And in the age of Latin, this woven worldview began to stretch across Europe with a fluidity no empire could match. Look to Iberia, where Celtic warriors left spiraled blades in graves overlooking the sea. Look to Bohemia, where chieftains were buried with chariots that gleam with curling iron motifs like frozen smoke. Look to Britain, where mirrors engraved with spirals, lay beside women, whose status still shines in the artistry that honoured them. Everywhere, the same flow, the same truth, the same whisper carried by metal and memory. The Celts were not a nation. They were a feeling, a current moving beneath the surface of the continent, a current that carried their language, their art, their rituals, their sense that the sacred lived not above, but around. It carried their feasting traditions, where cauldrons large enough to feed entire communities were cast in bronze, with looping handles and animal heads that seemed to watch the room. It carried their music, played on horns, that curved, like the art they forged, sounds that rolled across fields and into forests, echoing long after the players were gone. It carried their love of colour, reds from rare minerals, blues from crushed plants, patterns woven into fabric that moved like shadows behind firelight. And across all these currents, across all these lands, the spirit of Latin remained unmistakable. It was the moment the Celtic world looked outward, not to dominate, but to connect. The moment they stepped onto the stage of Europe, not as wanderers, or traders, or smiths, but as artists and thinkers and warriors, bound together by a shared vision of how life should move. And move it did, through battles where shields shimmered with swirling designs meant to dazzle an enemy's gaze, through ceremonies where offerings were thrown into lakes, because water, to the Celtic mind, was a doorway between worlds, through alliances sealed with feasts, where wine flowed from imported vessels, and local bards sung stories that braided truth and myth into a single glowing thread, through the rise of hill forts, not grim fortresses, but living towns of trade and craft and gathering, fortresses where people crafted jewellery so delicate that the metal seems to breathe under museum lights, fortresses where warriors trained on open ground, their movements a dance of practiced lines, as fluid as the art engraved on their blades, fortresses where druids watched the stars to mark seasons and foresee change, their minds as sharp as any sword. All of this movement, this bloom, this shimmering expansion was Latin, not just an artistic style, but a moment when the Celtic world defined itself, not by where it stood, but by how it moved. A moment when culture became identity, when identity became expression, and when expression became a map drawn across the land in spirals and lines, and the soft glow of polished metal. And if you listen closely, in this quiet moment, you may feel it, the same fluid energy that once flowed through Celtic hands as they shaped the world. A reminder that beauty is a kind of courage, that imagination is a kind of power, that identity is a kind of river, always moving, always reshaping, always finding its way. And in the next chapter, as the Celts rise into the full height of their spiritual and political world, you will see how this fluid power carried them into legend. For a long time after the spirals of Latin began to shimmer across Europe, the Celtic world continued to unfold in ways that felt less like a kingdom rising and more like a forest growing, quietly, steadily, branch by branch, root by root, until the landscape itself seemed to breathe with Celtic presence. Because this was the age when the Celts were not merely artists or traders or warriors, but a people woven so deeply into the land that to walk through their territories was to walk through a world built from relationships not laws, not decrees, not empires. Relationships. A Celtic kingdom was not a rigid structure of thrones and stone halls. It was a living network of families, clans, allies, vows, stories, and responsibilities carried in memory rather than written words. To understand the Celts, you must imagine a society held together, not by walls, but by honour, not by mandates, but by shared breath, not by a single ruler, but by a web of connections that reached from hearth to hearth, hill fort to hill fort, tribe to tribe, binding people, with threads, both fragile and impossibly strong. At the centre of this world stood the druids, not priests in the sense Rome would later imagine, but the memory keepers, the interpreters, the watchers of nature's quiet instructions. They carried no crowns, but kings listened. They commanded no armies, but warriors bowed their heads. They built no temples, because the forest itself was their sanctuary, and their knowledge was immense. They remembered genealogies, stretching back beyond human recollection. They judged disputes with a clarity drawn from tradition and observation, not written law. They knew which plants healed wounds, or sharpened the senses, or opened the mind to the quiet currents moving beneath the world. They watched the stars, not for omens of doom, but for patterns, natural rhythms, that aligned with the seasons of earth and the seasons of human life. They taught the young to honour the land. They taught the powerful to respect balance. They taught the grieving to understand that death was simply another doorway. And perhaps, most importantly, they protected the stories of creation, of ancestors, of heroes who shaped the land and were shaped by it. Stories that were not just entertainment, but identity, because, to the Celts, a story was a kind of soul, a way for a people to continue, even when individuals faded into the earth. And alongside the druids, the warriors rose, not mindless fighters, but men bound to their people by a code that was more emotional than legal. A warrior fought, not for glory, but for belonging, not for conquest, but for kin. His weapons were extensions of his promise to protect his clan, his hearth, his memory. A shield was a vow, a spear was responsibility, a sword was a story carried in metal. And yet, for all their fierceness, the Celts were also a deeply social people. Their feasts were not mere gatherings, but ceremonies of unity, tables heavy with meat, cauldrons steaming with broth, music rising like smoke, laughter rolling across the hall like waves breaking on rock. Feasting was politics. Feasting was diplomacy. Feasting was renewal. An alliance could be sealed with a shared drink. A dispute could be softened by a shared story. A warrior could be honoured not by treasure alone, but by the seat he was given at the table. And above it all, kingship emerged, not as absolute rule, but as stewardship. A Celtic king was chosen not for divine right or inheritance alone, but for ability. Someone who could hold the balance between clans, manage trade, lead in war, and settle disputes with fairness that even rivals could respect. A king was a centre, not a crown, a gathering point in a world without straight lines. And everywhere, beneath all this structure, the land remained sacred, not metaphorically. Literally, sacred groves were left untouched, circles of oak and yew, where druids listened for the voice of the living earth. Wells were honoured with offerings of bronze, iron, food, and sometimes treasures that seemed too valuable to bury. But to the Celts, giving to the earth was not loss, It was communion. Rivers could carry prayers. Lakes could hold memories. Mist could veil mysteries, meant only for those who understood how to look. And in this world of relationship and ritual and reverence, Celtic society found its shape, not rigid like Rome, not hierarchical like Persia, not bound by writing or bureaucracy, but fluid, living, intensely human, a system that grew naturally from the land that held it. And so the Celtic world took on a quality rare in ancient history, a sense that identity flowed from nature rather than from the throne. Their law was memory, their order was kinship, their wealth was loyalty, their power was unity, and their spirit, that unmistakable Celtic spirit, was built not from conquest, but from connection. Connection between people, connection between clans, connection between the living and the dead, connection between humans and the landscape that shaped them. And as you listen now, drifting deeper into the stillness of night, you may begin to feel how rare this world was, how gentle, how quietly profound, a society held together, not by fear or force or empire, but by meaning, by breath, by belief, by the simple, powerful truth that humans belong to one another and to the land that shelters them. In the next chapter, this world, so fluid, so beautiful, will collide with empires that do not understand it, empires that build with stone rather than memory, empires that demand obedience rather than belonging. And from that collision will come stories of resistance, tragedy, rebirth, and the kind of endurance that only a people rooted deeply in their land can truly understand. And yet, even in the quiet harmony that shaped this Celtic world, a world built not with stone, but with trust, not with walls, but with relationships, you can sense something else beneath the surface. A tension, a shadow, a distant rumble, like thunder too far away to be threatening, but close enough to remind you that even the gentlest societies exist within the movements of history, because the Celts, for all their fluidity, for all their reverence, for all their deep connection to nature and memory, were not sheltered from the storms that sweep across continents, and those storms were coming. But before they arrived, before foreign armies crossed forests and river plains, before iron helmets and marching feet echoed across the hills, the Celtic world lived through an age of extraordinary richness, an age where daily life was infused with ritual, with meaning, with threads, connecting every action to something greater. Take hospitality, for instance, a concept so sacred that a host was honor-bound to protect a guest, even at the cost of his own life. A traveller could walk through Celtic lands with the confidence that any hearth might open to him, that food would be offered, that stories would be exchanged, that safety would be granted. For to violate hospitality was not simply a breach of etiquette, it was a wound against the fabric of the world. Or consider fosterage, the practice of sending a child to be raised by another allied family. It sounds strange to us now, but to the Celts, this was among the strongest forms of unity. A child learned loyalty, not only to one household, but to two hearths, two mothers, two fathers, two sets of siblings. Kinship, in the Celtic mind, was not limited by blood, it was expanded by intention, and this expansion was guided by the druids, whose wisdom was so respected that even warriors who feared nothing before battle hesitated before disappointing a druid. Their teachings did not come from scrolls or tablets or libraries of stone. Their knowledge was carried in memory, vast, intricate networks of law and lore, woven through decades of disciplined thought. A druid might spend 20 years learning before he spoke with authority, but when he did, his words held the weight of generations. He knew which trees should be cut and which should be spared. He knew when a chieftain was fit to rule and when pride had clouded his judgment. He knew how to calm a feud with a sentence so precise that both sides felt they had won. To the Celts, wisdom was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and wisdom guided everything from war to marriage to planting crops in the rhythm of moon and season. The land itself was a teacher. A field was not simply a field, it was a memory of ancestors who had claimed it, ploughed it, tended it, and returned to it in death. A river was not a boundary, it was a pathway, a shimmering line connecting villages and clans through trade and story. A mountain was not an obstacle, it was an elder, ancient, silent, watching with a patience that no human could match. The Celts lived with a sense of presence that modern minds rarely experience. The world around them was alive. Everything had spirit. Everything had meaning. Everything was connected. A sword was not only a weapon, it carried the memory of the ore, pulled from earth, the fire that shaped it, the craftsman whose breath touched every inch of the blade. A cloak was not merely cloth, it held the warmth of sheep, the skill of the weaver, the dye of plants, gathered at dawn, the love of the one who gifted it. A feast was not only food, it was gratitude made visible. A burial was not only death, it was continuity, a reminder that life and the land were part of the same circle, and within that circle, the boundaries between the worlds were thin, so thin that during certain nights, certain seasons, certain moments, when the veil dissolved, the Celts believed the living and the dead could walk side by side. This was not fear, it was acceptance. The dead were never gone. They were simply in another room of the world, a room you could enter through dreams, through ritual, through the quiet stillness of sacred groves, where the air itself felt different, heavier with presence, lighter with possibility. To the Celts, the divine was not distant. It was intimate. It sat in the dew on the morning grass. It whispered in the rustling of oak leaves. It shimmered in the surface of a lake that held offerings beneath its calm skin. And this intimacy shaped their society into something rare, a world that valued balance over expansion, wisdom over ambition, ritual over record. But such a world, as beautiful as it was vulnerable to forces that did not share its values. For far beyond the Celtic forests and hill forts and mist-covered meadows, other civilizations were rising. Civilizations built not on relationship, but on order, on discipline, on conquest. Civilizations that measured power, not by unity, but by territory. Civilizations that wrote their laws in stone and built their futures in straight lines. And when those worlds met the Celts, a people of spirals and fluidity, of breath and belonging, the clash was inevitable. Not yet, not in this moment of harmony, but soon, the world of the Celts would be tested by empires that did not hear the music of their forests or understand the language of their land. And yet, before the storm arrives, before armies march. Across Celtic soil, before everything changes, there is a stillness, a deep, sacred stillness, in which the Celtic world stands whole. A world where connection is strength, where memory is law, where spirit is presence, where life and land move together in one ancient, enduring breath. In the next chapter, we will step closer to the moment when this breath meets the winds of an empire. For a long time, before the march of legions echoed through the valleys, and before the eagle standards glittered at the edge of the Celtic world, war among the Celts was something very different from the rigid discipline their enemies would one day bring. Celtic warfare was not born from empire building or territorial hunger. It was born from honour, from kinship, from the quiet oath a warrior carried in the centre of his chest, the oath to protect his people, to uphold his ancestors, to meet danger with the same fierce grace that shaped their art and their stories. A Celtic warrior did not march in perfect lines. He moved like the land itself, fluid, unpredictable, alive, with the untamed energy of wind in the high grass. His courage was not drilled into him by commanding officers. It was grown through stories at the hearth, through the weight of a spear placed in his hand, by elders, through the rhythm of training that blended strength with pride, fury, with artistry. Before battle, he might paint his skin with swirling patterns that echoed the same spirals found on his people's weapons. Not decoration, declaration, a reminder that courage flows, not from the body, but from the spirit. And when he stepped onto the field, his hair braided, his talk shining against his throat, like captured lightning, he carried not only his own breath, but the breath of his clan, his land, his gods. Yet the Celts did not rush blindly into combat. Their warriors were trained in ways that outsiders rarely understood. They used environment as their ally. Forests, hills, fog, the quiet knowledge of terrain that came from living so deeply within the land's rhythms. Their chariots were swift and strange to foreign eyes, light enough to dance across fields, strong enough to carry warriors into the heart of battle and out again as quickly as a hawk, rising and diving through open sky. A chariot was more than transport. It was a stage, a place where skill became spectacle, where bravery became performance, where the connection between warrior and horse was so refined that the movement seemed choreographed by something older than either of them, and their weapons, curved swords, long spears, shields painted with spirals, were shaped with the same artistry that defined their jewelry. Even in battle, beauty mattered, not vanity, identity. Yet for all their grace and fierceness, the Celts fought with emotion, with passion, with individuality, a strength and a vulnerability woven together like threads in a single braid, because where Rome would bring precision, the Celts brought presence. Where Rome would bring order, the Celts brought spirit. Where Rome would bring unity, the Celts brought 1,000 shining variations of courage. And for a time, this way of war was enough. It defended their lands, it preserved their clans, it carved legends into memory. But quietly, beyond the forests and rivers and sacred groves, a new kind of power was rising. A power built not on fluidity, but on structure, not on kinship, but on discipline, not on story, but on strategy. Rome, and though the Celts did not yet know it, their first encounters with this empire would begin. Like distant clouds, gathering at the horizon. At first, simple contact, rumours, merchants, a clash of scouts in some forgotten valley, moments small enough that no one recognised them as the beginning of something vast. Then, raids, Celtic warbands pushing south into lands Rome considered its own, not as conquest, but as opportunity, a way to earn wealth, to gain status, to prove worth. Rome noticed. Rome always noticed. And what Rome noticed, Rome remembered. In those days, the Celts were bold, fearless, and sometimes reckless. One tribe, or perhaps many, the stories blur, moved through the Alps, sweeping down into the plains of Italy like a storm. Breaking over stone, they defeated armies, they shocked senators, they reached the very heart of Roman pride. And Rome did not forget. But in this moment, in this chapter of Celtic life, conflict was still distant, still dim, still a shadow on the edge of a world full of song and story. Back home, in their own lands, the Celts continued to train, not for empire, but for honour. A young warrior might stand at dawn on a mist-wrapped hill, breathing deeply, feeling the grass, cold beneath his feet, listening for the quiet voice of the land that had shaped him. He would lift his spear, not with hunger for conquest, but with the weight of responsibility. He would feel the memory of ancestors settle around him like a cloak woven from wind. He would know that to fight was not merely to survive. It was to uphold the harmony between courage and duty, between self and clan, between the living and the dead. And before battle, a ritual, sometimes small, a whispered prayer, a hand placed upon sacred ground, sometimes grand, a gathering of druids, their voices rising like wind through oak leaves, their chants guiding warriors into the still, sharp clarity required for danger. To the Celts, war was not chaos, it was ceremony, and even as the world beyond their forests shifted and sharpened into the shape of an empire, the Celts remained rooted in the belief that spirit was their greatest weapon. But history rarely lets two worlds, so different, grow side by side, without collision. Rome was coming, with roads, straight as judgment, with armour, brighter than dawn, with soldiers, who moved, not like individuals, but like a single, unbroken line. And the Celts, with their spirals and stories, and sacred groves, with their courage, born of kinship, and their strength, born of freedom, would meet Rome, as they met all things, with heart. And yet, even as the shadow of Rome lengthened slowly across the horizon, the Celtic world continued to prepare in its own way, not with the drilling precision of legionaries, not with measured steps or rigid formations, but with a kind of alive and breathing readiness that rose from each warrior's deep connection to land and lineage. For a long time, before the two worlds truly collided, the Celts sharpened their courage through practice that felt almost like ritual, almost like dance. You might imagine them on a high hill at dusk, the sky washed in soft gold and violet, shadows stretching long across the grass. In that fading light, a young warrior would learn to listen, not for the sound of an approaching enemy, but for the movement of his own breath, for the subtle shift of wind around his body, for the way the earth seemed to hum quietly beneath his feet. He would learn to step lightly, to strike quickly, to move not as a soldier in formation, but as an animal whose instincts had been honed over centuries. This was the essence of Celtic warfare. Not uniformity, but presence. Not obedience, but attunement. A warrior's awareness was his shield. His spirit was his strongest armour. And when chariots rolled across open fields, their wheels cutting soft arcs into the soil, the sight itself was enough to unsettle enemies. The chariot was not built to crash into ranks or smash a formation apart. It was built for movement, swift, elegant, precise, a platform from which a warrior could leap, strike, retreat, and return again, like a storm that refused to be caught. Roman writers described Celtic chariots with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. The way they turned so sharply that horses and wheels seemed to bend around invisible corners, the way warriors balanced on the yoke bar as though weight meant nothing, the way they threw spears with such accuracy that even a shield wall felt vulnerable. And in this movement there was beauty, the same beauty that lived in Latin art, the same flowing energy that curled through spirals on sword hilts. The Celts carried their worldview into battle, fluid, alive, unpredictable. But Rome was rising, its power expanding, mile by mile, fort by fort, road by road. And as Rome expanded outward, the Celts felt the first tremors of a world that would soon demand confrontation. Skirmishes grew sharper, raids grew bolder. The Alpine passes became corridors where scouts met, with sudden violence, where each side tested the other, like animals circling before the first strike. Rome learned quickly. Rome always learned quickly. They noticed the ferocity of individual Celtic fighters, the brilliance of their sudden charges, the terror of their shouting assaults. But Rome also noticed something else, the lack of unity. 100 brave warriors could not always equal 100 disciplined soldiers moving with one mind. And so Rome waited, watching, measuring, mapping the world that lay beyond its borders. The Celts, meanwhile, continued to live with the same fierce individuality that shaped their art and their rituals. A Celtic war band did not march silently toward danger. They sang, they shouted, they let their passion fill the air before the clash. Their voices rose like storm winds, sweeping through a valley, a sound meant to shake the heart of any enemy who dared face them. A Roman soldier would later write that facing the Celts was like staring into the eyes of people who had been born, already knowing how to die. There was a wildness that Rome could not understand, not savagery, but freedom, a refusal to be tamed by fear. And before battle, the rituals deepened. A warrior might lift his sword to the sky, letting moonlight run down the blade like liquid silver. He might whisper the names of his ancestors, feeling them gather around him like unseen companions. He might touch the ground, pressing his palm into the earth, so that the land could remember him. If he fell, death to the Celts was not an ending, it was a returning. And so they walked toward danger without the hesitation that Rome expected. A Celtic warrior did not fight because he feared death. He fought because he loved life, the life of his clan, his land, his stories, his honour. This made him unpredictable, difficult to break, fearless, in ways that Rome had not seen in the disciplined armies of the Mediterranean. But courage alone cannot always reshape the tides of history, and the Celts, for all their brilliance, were still a constellation of tribes, each with its own leaders, its own heroes, its own rivalries. Rome, by contrast, was a single, relentless tide, a tide that did not rise, with emotion, but with structure, with reinforcement, with commanders, who thought in terms of decades rather than days. And though conflict was not yet inevitable, the slow wheel of history was turning. You can almost feel it. In this moment, the quiet unease. Beneath the surface, the soft tremor that runs through a world before an earthquake. The Celts, in all their wild grace, stood at the edge of an age that would test them more deeply than any feud, or famine, or distant raid. Soon, their war cries would rise against the thrum of marching legions. Soon, their chariots would meet Roman cavalry in spirals of dust and blood. Soon, the spirals of Latène would face the straight lines of Rome. But not yet. Here, in this moment of the story, the Celtic warrior still stands. On his mist-wrapped hill, spear in hand, heart steady, listening to the land that raised him. Here, his world is still whole. Here, the storm has not yet broken, and when it finally does, the Celts will face it, as they faced all things, with spirit, with fire, with the fierce, unshakable belief that freedom is worth any battle. For a long time, the clouds on the horizon had been only that, clouds, hints, warnings carried in the uneasy wind. But then, like all storms that gather for too long, the moment arrived when the sky finally opened. The first true collision between the Celts and Rome did not begin with diplomacy, or negotiations, or measured calculation. It began with movement, a tide of Celtic tribes, stirred by hunger, by pressure, by opportunity, by the restless nature of a world shifting beneath their feet. They crossed the Alps in a flow as wild and inevitable as snow melt, rushing down the mountains in spring. To Rome, they seemed like a force of nature, not an army, a people in motion, driven by need and courage and the ancient rhythm that had shaped them long before. Rome built her first walls. The Romans called them barbari, not out of hatred, but out of confusion, because no word in their ordered vocabulary could capture a people who fought like wind, who lived like rivers, who led with passion instead of discipline. And when these Celts reached the river Allia, north of Rome, the Romans finally saw what their scouts had whispered: tall warriors with hair the colour of dawn-lit fire, chariots that skimmed the ground with eerie lightness, swords curved like half-moons caught in metal, eyes alive with something fierce and unbroken. Rome marched out to face them, a young republic still learning its own shape, still believing that structure could withstand anything. But on the banks of the Allia, order met wildness, discipline met spirit, rigidity met flow, and flow overwhelmed structure. The Roman lines broke like thin reeds in a sudden flood. Their shields splintered, their formations collapsed. Men ran, not from cowardice, but from the shock of facing a kind of courage they had never imagined. The Celts did not chase as conquerors. They moved as they always had, with momentum, with instinct, with the rising thrill of battle that felt almost ceremonial. And so, with Rome defeated, the path lay open before them, leading south through rolling hills, bathed in summer light, toward a city that had never believed she could fall. Rome, imagine it, the 7 hills, looming in silence, the Tiber moving slowly like an old thought, citizens staring toward the horizon. as the dust of the Celtic advance rose into the air. A city, not yet an empire, not yet a legend, just a frightened settlement, watching its fate approach. The Celts arrived, not as raiders, but as a tide, as if the north itself had come walking. They entered Rome with a mixture of awe and indifference, the awe of seeing a place that pulsed with dense human ambition, the indifference of warriors who had not come to rule, but to claim what had been promised and denied. The Senate sat in silence, refusing to flee their dignity, a final shield. The Celts walked past them, startled that these old men sat unmoving, like carved statues, their faces set in a stillness that tasted like resignation. And then, for the first time, Rome learned what it meant to feel vulnerable. The Celts ransomed the city. Rome paid. The Celts left. A meeting, both shocking and strangely swift. A collision that felt less like conquest and more like two worlds touching for the first time, neither understanding what the other truly was. But Rome remembered. Rome always remembered. In the years that followed, the Republic reforged itself with a new purpose, to never again be humbled by a people so unpredictable, so passionate, so fiercely alive. The Celts, meanwhile, returned north, unburdened by dreams of empire, content to drift back into their forests and rivers and sacred groves. To them, the clash had been a moment, a swell in the rhythm of life, not the beginning of a greater war. But history does not forget. Moments like this, in that brief encounter, two ways of being stood face to face, a world of spirals, and a world of straight lines, a world of breath, and a world of discipline, a world of fluidity, and a world of structure. The Celts did not know it, but Rome had marked them not as enemies, as a threat to be studied, an obstacle to be overcome, a challenge to be solved. And as the Celtic warriors walked back north through the passes of the Alps, their chariots leaving soft tracks in the dust, their laughter echoing against ancient stone, their spirits light. With victory, Rome was already reshaping itself into something harder, sharper, more relentless, because Rome is never defeated, only once. Rome rebuilds, Rome remembers, Rome returns, and the Celts, still living within the rhythm of land and story, still trusting in spirit, more than structure, still believing in the power of the individual warrior, did not yet sense the scale of what was coming. But you can feel it now, in the quiet space between these words, the soft hum of two worlds moving inevitably toward another meeting, one that would not end with ransom or retreat, one that would shape centuries. And in this lingering quiet, after victory had come, as unexpectedly as a summer storm, breaking open the sky, the Celts moved northward with the same fluid ease with which they had descended, a tide returning to its familiar shores, a heartbeat resuming its steady rhythm. Behind them, Rome remained, a city shaken to its foundations, its pride cracked, its certainty split down the middle like a stone struck by frost. The Romans, who had survived the humiliation of Alia, did not merely rebuild walls, they rebuilt themselves, piece by piece, layer by layer, with a determination that frightened even those who later admired it. For Rome had discovered a truth she had never tasted before: vulnerability. And vulnerability in certain hearts does not give rise to humility. It gives rise to resolve. In the months that followed, Romans whispered, the name of the Celts, with a mix of awe and trembling anger. Those tall warriors, with voices like thunder, those chariots that moved like lightning across open ground, those fierce eyes that shone with something Rome did not yet understand. It was said that even the geese on Rome's sacred hill had cried out when all else fell silent, a strange detail, half legend, half memory, that clung to Roman minds as a symbol of how close their world had come to vanishing. The Senate, wounded in pride, vowed quietly that never again would Rome allow herself to be so exposed, and so, stone by stone, she strengthened her defences. Road by road, she knitted Italy together. Law by law, she centralized power into something no tribe could intimidate. But even as Rome rebuilt, the Celts were already far away, moving through their forests and riverlands with no thought that they had awakened a force far more dangerous than they had left behind. To the Celts, the raid had been extraordinary, yes, a story worth telling, a moment of pride, a surge of adrenaline, and victory and celebration, but nothing more. They had no sense of having struck a future empire. They had no desire to settle in Italy or shape politics beyond their own horizons. They were a people of cycles, not conquests, of seasons, not systems, of breath, not bureaucracy. And so the Celts returned to their rivers, their meadows, their hill forts, buzzing with daily life. They returned to the rhythm of harvests, of festivals, of feasts, of births and blessings, and battles fought for honour rather than ambition. Yet the world does not forget the places where two destinies brush against each other. Whispers spread across Europe of a great city in the south that had been humbled by the northern tribes. Some told the story with reverence, others with joy, others with fear. Merchants carried the tale along the river routes. Wanderers added embellishments until the Celts seemed like giants with flaming hair and voices that shook mountains. Even among distant people who had never seen a Celtic warrior, the name of these tribes began to shimmer with a strange, mythic power. But not all shimmer is blessing. Rome's fear was a seed that would grow into something vast, larger than any single tribe, deeper than any single memory. And beyond Italy, other powers watched the rising tension with the wary eyes of wolves studying wolves. To the east, the Greeks observed from their colonies in the Adriatic. To the north, Germanic tribes. I wondered whether the Celts now walked in a destiny bigger than themselves. To the west, the Iberian world listened as the story reached their mountain passes, and above it all, in the quiet places where druids listened to the voice of the land, there was a shift, a subtle change in the air, a soft warning that the world was tilting toward something it had never known before. Because if Rome was a river cutting a straight path through the land, the Celts were the currents of countless streams that crossed and mingled and braided together in ways Rome would never understand. Yet a straight river and a flowing web cannot long occupy the same valley without coming into conflict. And so, in the years after the Alea, as Rome steeled herself into something hard and disciplined and unyielding, the Celts continued their migrations across Central Europe, south into the Po Valley, east into the Balkans, west into the riverlands of Gaul and Iberia, not as conquerors, but as settlers, explorers, wanderers who moved with curiosity instead of strategy. In these movements, they brushed again against Rome's sphere. Small clashes erupted along borders. Not yet war, but not peace either. Testing, measuring, feeling the edge of another world's presence. A Roman patrol might find itself facing a Celtic scouting party, not with hatred, but with the wary recognition of two animals meeting at the riverbank just as dawn breaks. A Celtic chieftain might hear stories of Roman engineers building long, unnaturally straight roads through the countryside, like scars carved into living earth. Sometimes there was trade, sometimes laughter, sometimes uneasy silence, but always beneath the surface. Of each encounter, there was the quiet truth that neither world fully understood the other. Rome could not comprehend a people so free of centralized authority. The Celts could not comprehend a society so rigid that even its roads refused to bend. And in this tension lay the beginnings of something larger, a slow gathering of forces that neither side had intended, but both sides would one day be swallowed by. For Rome, the Celts had become a wound that refused to close. For the Celts, Rome had become a noise, far away in the distance, a noise easy to ignore, until the day it grows too loud to sleep through. And in the quiet spaces between these shifting realities, the world was changing. You can feel it in the tremble beneath the words, in the slow widening of the narrative horizon, in the way two worlds seem to draw closer with every breath. Two worlds, neither good nor evil, neither destined to win nor destined to fall, simply destined to meet. And when they meet again, it will not be as raiders and republic, but as civilizations. And the weight of that meeting will echo for centuries. When you are ready, we will walk into the next threshold, the moment when Rome rises in full force, and the Celts must decide whether to stand, to scatter, or to change. For a long time, after the Celts returned north, leaving Rome shaken, but alive, the world held its breath in the quiet space between two destinies. The Celts thought the story was finished, a raid completed, a victory secured, a memory to be folded into song and tale. Rome thought the story was beginning, and slowly, quietly, relentlessly, the Republic began to rise, not with the wild surge of a Celtic warband, but with the steady climb of stone walls built, one block at a time, with the discipline of men who marched, as if every footstep were part of a single, unbroken heartbeat, with a will that hardened each time they remembered the humiliation at the Alea. Rome rebuilt, but not merely what the Celts had burned. She rebuilt her spirit, and as she rose, she turned her gaze northward toward the green valleys of the Po River, toward the shimmering plains, where Celtic tribes had begun to settle, toward the mountains, whose passes had once carried warriors straight to her gates. Rome watched these lands with cold, measured attention, and when she judged the time was right, she began to move, not in a rush, not in anger, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of an empire, learning to stretch. First came envoys, then came demands, then came armies, organized, armored, relentless. The tribes of Cisalpine Gaul, who had wandered south for richer soil and easier winters, found themselves face to face with a Rome that no longer trembled at the sight of Celtic warriors. The first battles were small, skirmishes in the foothills, clashes near fords, echoes of conflict that rippled outward like pebbles dropped into still water. But then, in the high summer heat, the ripples became waves. At Telamon, The Celts marched with pride, a great host, drawn from many tribes, carrying memories of past victories, like talks of honour around their throats. They wore bright colours, they sang battle songs, they carried standards shaped like beasts that glimmered. In the sun, their chariots rolled forward with the calm confidence of people who had never doubted their own courage. Rome brought legions, lines tight as iron, shields locked like scales of a single creature, spears poised, steady, unmoved by the thunder of Celtic voices. Two worlds faced each other across a field so wide it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. And when the battle began, it was not wild or swift or bright like the Celtic clashes of old. It was grinding, methodical, a slow tightening of discipline around fury. The Celts fought brilliantly, their first charge striking Rome with the force of a falling oak. Swords sang, shields splintered, voices rose in roaring waves. But Rome did not break. She absorbed the charge, like rock taking the crash of storm waves. She shifted formations with perfect timing. She rotated units before exhaustion could weaken them. She used discipline as a weapon more deadly than any blade. And when the dust finally settled, the field belonged to Rome. Telamon was not merely a battle, it was a message. The Celts felt its weight. Rome felt its momentum. But Telamon was only the beginning. Soon came Clastidium, where a Celtic king fell beneath a Roman commander's determined hand. A small battle, perhaps, but one Rome recounted again and again, a story woven into her rising confidence. Then came Sentinum, where Rome did not face only the Celts, but a coalition of forces. Yet still she prevailed. Each victory was a stone laid in the road. Rome was building toward dominance. Each defeat was a fracture in the great web of Celtic tribes, because the Celts, for all their courage, carried within them a quiet weakness, not in spirit, but in unity. Their strength came from individuality. Their weakness came from individuality. For while the Romans fought as one body, the Celts fought as many hearts, brilliant, passionate, fierce, but not always aligned. A tribe in the east might not aid a tribe in the west. A chieftain might choose honour over strategy, glory over caution, freedom over alliance. And Rome saw this. Rome studied this. Rome used this. One by one, tribes fell, territories shrank. The once vast Celtic presence in northern Italy was pushed back, compressed, narrowed. Yet even as they lost ground, the Celts did not lose spirit. A defeated Roman might doubt. A defeated Celt only sharpened his resolve. But resolve cannot stop an empire that has learned to draw strength from defeat. And Rome had learned. She marched with renewed purpose, her legions moving like a tide, advancing over stone. She built roads so her armies could arrive. Before Celtic warbands had even finished gathering, she built fortresses that anchored her presence deep in contested lands. She built alliances with tribes willing to shift their loyalties. And all the while, the Celts watched the horizon darken with a new kind of inevitability. Some chieftains argued for retreat. Others argued for unification. Others still argued for nothing, trusting in fate, in courage, in the old ways that had shaped them. But the world was changing, and the old ways, as beautiful as they were not designed to face an enemy that marched with the silence of stone. Yet even then, in this chapter of tightening pressure, the Celts did not despair. They feasted, they told stories, they sang beneath the moon. They lived with the same fierce joy that had always defined them, because to the Celtic soul, victory and defeat were threads of the same tapestry, both temporary, both fleeting, both part of the eternal cycle of rise and fall and rise again. But history, like rivers, has currents stronger than intention. By the end of this long era of conflict, Rome had established her foothold. The Celts had begun to feel the weight of something new, a presence that would not leave, a shadow that would not recede. And yet the story was far from over. For even as the Celts lost ground in the south, their spirit burned brighter in the west and north, in Gaul, in Britannia, in the mist-laden isles, where Rome had not yet dared to tread. The next chapter belongs to that spirit, to the great tribes of Gaul, to the warrior queens of Britain, to the resistance that would rise like fire against the coming empire. But even as Rome's foothold hardened and the Celts felt the ground shift beneath them, the world was not yet ready to surrender the old rhythm that had carried Celtic tribes through mountains and rivers and entire ages, with nothing but courage and kinship and the fierce certainty that freedom was worth everything, because the Celts, unlike Rome, did not measure themselves through victory alone. Their spirit was not attached to the drawing of borders, or the holding of territory, or the stamping of symbols onto conquered lands. Their sense of identity was something deeper, rooted in memory, in song, in the wind that passed through sacred groves, as though carrying the breath of their ancestors. So even as Rome pushed northward, even as fortresses rose, like new, angular shadows, across fields that had once belonged to wandering clans, the Celts remained themselves, fluid in movement, unpredictable in resolve, capable of splintering and reforming, like a constellation shifting in the night sky. Some tribes retreated into forests, so thence that Roman soldiers felt as though they were marching into the lungs of the earth. Dark places, quiet places, places where legions, so sure in open fields, began to feel their certainty melt like frost under morning light. Other tribes retreated into the mountains, high ridges, where goats found footholds, but armies struggled where a dozen Celtic warriors could hold a pass against an entire Roman cohort, simply by knowing which stones were loose beneath the moss. And still others moved westward into the heartlands of Gaul, into plains so wide that the sky itself seemed to bend over them like a great blue shield. There, in those vast spaces, the Celts found room to breathe again, to rebuild, to gather strength from the sheer openness of the living world. Rome could take valleys, Rome could take passes, but Rome could not take the wind. And it was in Gaul that the Celtic spirit began to change, not by breaking, but by deepening, by growing a new kind of unity, forged not from necessity alone, but from the shared recognition that the world was shifting, that the empire would not stop, that the old ways would not be enough. In Gaul, chieftains began to speak with other chieftains. More often than before, their councils held not only in moments of danger, but in moments of uneasy foresight. Bards sang new verses, songs that did not only glorify the victories of the past, but warned of the storms gathering. In the south, druids stood beneath ancient oaks and felt in the trembling of leaves a future that would demand not only bravery, but change. And slowly, as whispers gathered into discussions, and discussions into plans, the Celtic heartlands began to understand something that had never before been part of their world. That unity might be the only shield against a power that did not grow tired, did not lose momentum, did not forget insult. Gaul was vast, but Rome was patient, and soon Rome pushed again, this time not through northern Italy, but across the southern edges of the Gallic world, pressing forward with roads that cut straight lines through ancient forests, with forts that anchored new territories like iron nails driven into the living earth. The Celts responded the way they always had, first in small war bands, quick and fierce, then in larger gatherings that swept across valleys like weather fronts. At times, they won, and Rome recoiled, surprised at the raw intensity of warriors fighting for the breath of their homelands. At other times, they were scattered, their brilliance overwhelmed by the relentless advance of hammering discipline and unbroken formations. But always they returned, and Rome took note. Rome learned the shape of their chariots, the rhythm of their charges, the unpredictable crescendos of their courage. Rome learned that Celtic warriors did not break until their bodies did. Rome learned that Celtic tribes could vanish into forests as though swallowed by the dark. Rome learned that fighting the Celts was like fighting smoke. You could grasp it, hurt it, push it back, but never quite contain it. And yet, with every campaign, the inevitable moved a little closer, because Rome was not merely an army. Rome was a memory that did not fade. Rome was a wound that did not close. Rome was a will that did not soften. And while the Celts carried the fire of 100 tribes, their brilliance was scattered, their courage shining in 1,000 directions, rather than one. In the south, tribes fell. In the east, fortresses rose. In the north, more and more chieftains began to feel that trembling shift of a future leaning toward shadow. And yet still, the Celts did not yield. Instead, they grew fiercer. They sharpened old alliances. They forged new confederations. They raised warriors whose names would echo for centuries. Giants of spirit who stood at the edges of history, like torches burning against the wind. But those stories, those fires, belong to what comes next. For now, in this closing breath of the 7th chapter, the world stands on the edge of something immense, Rome rising, like a tide that does not retreat, Gaul preparing, like a forest stirred by distant thunder. And you, listening here, in the softness of night, can feel the weight of what is coming, the collision of empire and spirit, of discipline and freedom, of straight lines and spirals, a collision that will shake nations, reshape maps, birth legends, and carve new myths into the bones of history. When you are ready, we will step forward into the fires of Gaul toward the tribes, who rose like storms toward the queens, who carried thunder beneath their crowns toward the last great blaze of Celtic resistance before the shadow of empire swept across their world for a long time before Rome ever set her gaze. Across the Channel, before Caesar dreamed of Britain, before Boudicca's voice roared like fire. Across the land, the islands to the west lived in a rhythm both ancient and astonishingly alive. Britain and Ireland, two worlds carved from mist, rain, and stone, rising from the sea like sleeping giants, wrapped in green. To the Celts, these islands were not edges of the world, they were beginnings, places where memory ran deeper than rivers, where the land held stories in its hills and whispered them through its forests, like breath through a wooden flute. When the Celts arrived, first in small movements, then in larger waves that followed rivers and game trails and the curved lines of the coastline. The islands welcomed them like old friends, and slowly, softly, patiently, a new chapter of the Celtic world began to unfold. These newcomers brought with them the same spirals, the same iron, the same love for story and ceremony that had blossomed on the continent. But the islands shaped them too. Britain, with its rolling plains, its chalk cliffs, its wide sky, stretching like an open palm above fields of grain. Ireland, with its deep forests, its shadowed boglands, its hills that rose like waves frozen in emerald stone. The Celts did not conquer these lands. They merged with them, and the lands merged with them in return. Tribes began to form, groups bound not by written laws, but by kinship, memory, and the quiet understanding that every person was one thread in a fabric woven from generations. In the south of Britain, the Catuvela Oni held fertile valleys where trade flowed like water through the hands of ambitious chieftains. In the west, the Cilias and Ordovices watched the mountains as if the stones themselves were guardians of their world. In the north, the tribes of Caledonia lived in lands where forests thickened into shadows and the cold cut deeper than Roman steel ever would. And across the sea, in Ireland, societies blossomed like wildflowers, tuath after tuath, each one a kingdom in miniature, led by chieftains who carried both authority and humility, for their power was not absolute, but earned through generosity, wisdom, and fairness. Ireland's world was a tapestry of poets, smiths, warriors, herdsmen, droughts, who memorized the laws of the land as if they were melodies, and storytellers who carried a nation's soul within their voices. And through all of Britain and Ireland, the Celtic warrior found new expression, no longer only the charioteer of the Latin heartlands. He adapted to the islands, terrain and spirit. In the dense forests, he became a hunter, moving quietly, precisely, like a shadow cut free from the trees. In the open plains, he became a rider, swift, fluid, circling his enemies like wind around a solitary stone. In the boglands, he became a ghost, appearing and vanishing. Between reed beds, his footsteps muffled by earth that swallowed sound. And through all this, druids remained, the steady pulse of the Celtic Isles. Their groves were places where time bent and softened, circles of oak, where rituals unfolded in whispers and knowledge, passed from elder to youth, like a candle flame passed between hands. In the darkness, they knew the paths of stars over the Irish Sea, the secrets of mist that hung above Wiltshire Plains, the sacredness of wells and springs, where offerings of gold, food, cloth, and memory were given freely to the living earth. And it was here, in Britain and Ireland, that Celtic art became something new, a dance of curves and animals, of patterns that seemed almost to breathe. Designs spiraled across shields, mirrors, brooches, cauldrons, stones, themselves becoming a language that needed no alphabet to speak. Trade flowed, not only with Gaul, but between tribes, between islands, between spirits of land and water. And so it was that Britain and Ireland grew bright, their societies complex, their cultures deep, their spirits strong. But even then, even in the golden quiet of this island age, shadows began to form. Au distant horizon, for Rome, had not forgotten the tribes across the sea. Rome had not forgotten the threat of Celtic courage. Rome had not forgotten the humiliation carved into her memory so many years ago. And soon, very soon, the legions would turn their gaze toward the mist, above the channel, toward the cliffs that shone pale in morning light, toward a land that had never bowed to an empire, a land that would resist as fiercely as wildfire in dry grass, a land that would give birth to names carried in trembling awe across history's pages: Cassivellaunus, Caratacus, Boudica. But that is a tale for another night. For now, as you lie here, in the quiet, eyes growing heavy, breath softening, you rest at the threshold of a world where the Celtic spirit burned with its most vibrant flame before the conquest, before the fall, before the long dusk. Here, in this moment, Britain and Ireland are alive with possibility, a world built from mist and courage, from song and memory, from the fierce belief that identity is not written in stone or law, but carried in the living breath of a people who know who they are. And when you are ready, we will step forward into the storm that waits across the channel, a storm of iron, of fire, of queens, who rose like thunder, and empires that learned too late that spirit cannot be conquered as easily as land. For a long time, the islands lived in a balance, so gentle it seemed as though the world itself had paused there, allowing Britain and Ireland to grow their cultures like lanterns glowing behind veils of mist, and the Celts, who had wandered so far across mountains and rivers and plains that stretched beyond sight, found in these islands a kind of stillness that felt like home. Not stillness without movement, but stillness with meaning, a peace that grew roots inside the land. Here, the seasons spoke more slowly. Winter lingered, with frost that traced pale patterns on heather. Spring unfurled, with shy blossoms, pushing through cold soil. Summer ripened the hills in long afternoons of gold. Autumn fell softly, like ancient memory, returning to the earth. The Celts learned these rhythms as if they were learning a second heartbeat, and in that learning, their society on the islands grew deeper, more intricate, more connected to the pulse of the land. In Britain, tribal centres emerged, not cities, with stone walls and paved streets, but hill forts that rose like crowns upon the ridges, their ramparts bending with the curves of the hills, their gates watching the valleys like patient sentinels. Maiden Castle, its massive embankments, spiralling like a sleeping serpent across the Dorset heights. Danebury, where generations of farmers and warriors carved their lives into the chalk earth. Traprainlaw, rising above the Lothian plains like a stone altar built for sky and wind. These hill forts were more than defences. They were gathering places, markets, ritual grounds, centres of memory, where songs were woven into the air and decisions were shaped by the voices of elders, warriors, women, and druids. And in Ireland, centres of power took on a different form. Ring forts, huddled like circles of protection across the countryside, each one a tiny world, a hearth around which families lived and died and passed their names to new generations. Royal sites rose like myths, carved into the land itself. Tara, with its gentle ridges, where kings once stood to face the wind and pledge themselves to the people. Emain Macha, seat of warriors, whose stories lived long after their bodies returned to earth. Cruachan, where queens and prophets walked between worlds with eyes that saw into memory and into fate. And everywhere, On both islands, society bloomed with complexity, but not the kind that grows from paperwork or laws etched in stone, or bureaucracies that divide life into rigid lines. This was a softer complexity, a web woven from relationships and obligations and gifts exchanged beneath the sky. A chieftain's wealth was measured not by coins, but by cattle, by alliances, by the loyalty of those who stood beside him in feast and in battle. A craftsperson's worth was shaped not by market value, but by the beauty of their work, the way a brooch caught the morning light, the way a cauldron held heat without cracking, the way a carved stone felt alive beneath the fingertips. And a druid's power lay not in dominance, but in the trust bestowed by those who sought their wisdom, warriors seeking clarity before battle, mothers seeking healing for their children, chieftains seeking counsel when decisions weighed too heavily on the heart. In these lands, knowledge was not owned. It flowed, passed from voice to voice, from dusk to dawn, from parent to child, in an unbroken chain, stretching back to ages. No one remembered, and no one needed to. Their stories, too, deepened, stories of spirits, in rivers and wells, stories of heroes, whose courage echoed across centuries, stories of women, whose strength was honoured as fiercely as any warrior's, stories of the Morrigan, whose shadowy wings stirred the air before battles, whose presence was both warning and protection, stories of Lug, bright warrior and master of many crafts, whose skill seemed to belong to every art and every path, stories of Rhiannon, whose horse moved faster than wind, whose dignity endured trials that would break lesser hearts. These stories were not myths to be believed or doubted. They were mirrors that reflected the deepest truths of the people who told them. And in this world of mist and song and ever-moving memory, the Celtic islands grew strong in ways Rome could not understand. Rome saw wealth in gold. The Celts saw wealth in cattle and in honour. Rome saw power in walls. The Celts saw power in kinship and in the land itself. Rome saw unity in control. The Celts saw unity in shared breath, shared ritual, shared belonging. And perhaps it was here, in this profound difference, that conflict became inevitable. For Rome, expansion was the natural order of things, a flame seeking fuel. For the Celts, freedom was the natural order, a wind seeking sky. Two worlds moving toward each other on parallel lines that would one day collide, but not yet, not in this moment. Here, Britain and Ireland still breathe in the golden quiet before the storm. Farmers walk the fields before sunrise, their footsteps soft in the dew. Warriors watch the treetops for signs of movement, their hands resting on spears. They hope they will not need. Children chase each other through ring forts where ancestors once sat in judgment. Elders gather around fires that flicker beneath starlight, untouched by the glow of cities. And along the coasts, fishermen listen to the sea as though it were a teacher, its waves telling stories older than tribes, older than iron, older even than the names of gods. For a long time, this world endured, peaceful, balanced, whole. But across the channel, Rome sharpened its gaze, its ambitions unfolding like a map unrolled upon a table, its legions preparing to move in straight lines toward a land built from spirals. Soon, The cliffs of Dover would watch Roman sails, cutting through cold water. Soon, the forests of Britain would hear the echoes of marching feet. Soon, the Celts of the islands would rise in resistance that would burn so brightly it would leave scars and legends carved into history. But tonight, none of that has arrived. Tonight, you rest with the Celts in the last calm dusk before stormlight touches the sea. Tonight, you breathe with a people whose identity was shaped not by empire, but by earth, not by power, but by belonging, not by conquest, but by the quiet knowing that spirit, true spirit, cannot be broken. When you are ready, we will cross the channel into the age of resistance, into the rise of queens who shook the ground, into the battles that turned mist into fire and memory into legend.